The name Weobley is likely to have been derived from Wibber's Lee or land, Wibber being a Saxon name. It is thought to have been founded in the 6th century by Prince Wibber, son of Crader, King of Mercia. The village would have been no more than a clearing in the forest that covered this area, and an outpost against the encroachments of the Welsh. By the Domesday Book in 1086, the manor of Weobley was held by Roger de Lacy. He had been at the Battle of Hastings with William and came from Lassay in Normandy. He held 65 lordships and 18 manors throughout Herefordshire. He died in 1085. His lands passed to his son Roger, but he rebelled against the king and was banished to Normandy. Thus Weobley passed to his brother Hugh. It was Hugh who was responsible for the construction of the castle and the first stone church. The de Lacy line died out in the 1350s, and the estate passed to the de Vernons, Crophulls, Devereux, Times, and finally to the Marquis of Bath, who sold his final holdings in 1921. A family seat was established in the 13th century, probably by John Gardner, a benefactor of Wormsley Priory. The original house was, however, built by the Tonkin family in 1553, half a mile to the southeast of the village. In 1661 it was purchased by Colonel Birch, one of Cromwell's officers, and turned into Garnston Castle. In 1807 a new house was constructed, designed by Nash, on a new site further down the hill. Tragically, this was demolished in 1959. The castle was built by Roger de Lacy, or his brother, in the 11th century. It was captured in 1139 by Geoffrey Talbot, who also took Hereford, and held for Queen Matilda before being recaptured by King Stephen. In 1208 it was captured by William de Brough, Lord of Brecon, who had rebelled against King John. It was used as his base to attack Leinster with his ally Matthew de Gamage, Lord of Dilwyn. Its final historical appearance was in 1262, when it failed to protect Weobley from Llewellyn plundering his way to Hereford. By the 15th century it was already decaying, and there was nothing remaining of the buildings by 1655. In Hereford Road is the Old Grammar School. Built in 1659 as a free school, it continued until 1856. Opposite is the throne. In September 1645, Charles I briefly resided in what was then the Unicorn Inn after the Battle of Naseby. Towards the centre of the village is the current Unicorn Inn. The eastern part is 17th century, but the western part of the building dates from the 14th century, with a timber-framed hall and wings projecting only above the upper floors. The salutation is 16th century and incorporates charred barge boards from a demolished medieval building. Markets were held in the area at the southern end of Broad Street, where a market hall once stood. The first market charter was granted in 1261, but there is evidence of a market being held as early as 1231. Weobley was one of the famous rotten boroughs, returning 2 members of Parliament from 1295 until 1307, and then again from 1628. With the disenfranchisement of the 1832 Reform Act, the Marquis of Bath, who controlled the seats, lost interest in the village, and during his ownership at least 40 medieval buildings were demolished, including the Market Hall. On the east side of Broad Street we have the imposing buildings that were originally the Bear Inn and the Gables, a large 15th century timber-framed building with 2 cross wings and a central hall. This has now been infilled with stone and the front overhang removed. At the bottom of Broad Street is a 14th century hall house. Opposite is the contemporary Red Lion Inn, although this was much altered in the 17th and 18th centuries. To the rear it incorporates a medieval cottage, with 2 heavy cruck trusses illustrating its method of construction. Beyond is Bell Square, formerly Pound Street, crossed by the Marlbrook. Here are 2 of the best preserved examples of 14th century buildings. These houses show clearly the typical structure of middle-class houses of the period, with a central hall now divided into 2 floors and 2 cross wings. We can now turn to St Peter's and St Paul's. The first mention of a priest in Weobley is in the Domesday Book in 1086, and the first stone church was built by Hugh de Lacy, who became lord of the manor in 1091. He also founded Lantony Abbey and the Augustine Priory at Wormsley. The tower, the second highest in Herefordshire, was constructed between 1330 and 1340, and may well have originally been built separate from the church as a refuge from the marauding Welsh. In 1640 the spire was blown down and reconstructed by Colonel Birch. It had to be rebuilt again in the Victorian era. The south porch was constructed in 1325, and the door is dated to 1712. The sundial on the porch is a modern reproduction of the 1663 original. This leads into the oldest part of the church. At the east end of the south aisle is the former chapel of St Nicholas. The chancel is late 13th century, but with Victorian stained glass windows. Next to the altar stands an elaborate monument to Colonel Birch. A Lancastrian by birth, he had been a pack-horse carrier before the Civil War, but his military talents led to preferment under Cromwell. In 1646 he took Hereford, commandeering the bishop's palace, but his rule ended in martial law. Turning to politics, he was returned as an MP for Leinster, but subsequently imprisoned for royalist sympathies in 1655. These suspicions proved well founded, as he was returned as MP for Penryn in Cornwall in the Cavalier Parliament at the Restoration. A nimble gentleman, and one who used to neglect no opportunity to provide for himself, he prospered, and in 1661 he bought Garnston, becoming Weobley's MP in 1679 until his death in 1691. With no surviving sons, his attempts to impress posterity were reduced to his extraordinary monument in Weobley Church, a monument whose Republican sympathies managed to create local outrage. The effigy against the north wall is believed to be that of Sir William Devereux, who died in 1402 in the Glendyre Wars. On the opposite side is the tomb of Agnes Devereux, who outlived her husband and married Sir John Marbury, who held various posts under Henry V. The north aisle is 14th century and was widened in the 15th century to incorporate the tower. Against the north wall is a 15th century altar tomb. Thought originally to have been situated in one of the chapels, it was moved to in front of a blocked doorway. From 1678 it was from this altar that £5 worth of bread and loaves were distributed on Low Sunday to the poor in the bequest of John Goodman of Devereux Wootton. This practice ended only in the 19th century. Beyond the village, to the west, is the Ley, one of the finest timber-frame houses in the county. It was originally constructed around 1589 by James Bridges in the early Renaissance style on the site of an earlier house. The earliest reference to the Leys was in 1272, when one William de Ley was Sheriff of Herefordshire. The Bridge family acquired the property in 1428. They were Royalists and Roman Catholics, and the house only survived the Civil War through their absence and the protection afforded by the Earl of Leven, commanding the Scots army in Hereford. When they returned, they were financially crippled by heavy fines, and by 1702 the Bridges were no longer resident at the Ley.